And then you've got on the other end of the spectrum, of course, you have the pure materialists, and I'd put Sagan in that group and say it can't be, therefore it isn't.
Mm.
And you go, but as Dean Radin liked to say, the evidence for psi, if psi were a crime, it would be convicted, no doubt. The evidence is just overwhelming. When you say anyone who says there's no evidence means I haven't looked.
Could you just tell me a little bit about your Carl Sagan story? You said that you had a good one. Remember I was asking you just in my email.
Yeah, well, Carl Sagan is not my favorite person. As a
Mm.
matter of fact, one of the things I point out is there's a book called UFOs, a Scientific Debate, and Sagan is one of the co-editors in it. And the book is actually pretty good. Parts of it are. And it is a firm debate between proponents and opponents. And what I found interesting is that the proponents talking about UFOs reality were speaking facts, and the opponents are all speaking emotion.
Mm.
And what was interesting to me is that, it was after that Cosmos came out and he infamous quote, and there's not one shred of evidence.
Uh-huh.
And my response to that was, don't you read your own stuff? Because he has published things that were certainly providing evidence. The other story I was going to mention when I put that in the email, the SSE was meeting at Cornell 1 year, and so because we were there, they invited Sagan to talk, and he came in and gave and then I was sitting literally right behind him. And I don't know if you remember Robert John, JHN, who had been the dean of the School of Engineering at Princeton and had the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Laboratory, and had uh, got up and gave a presentation on, I mean, their stuff was in billions of replications of decision points and the ability to mentally influence both PK and remote viewing. And Sagan goes, yeah, no, that's the way research should be done. So I talked to Bob after that. He says, well, hell, I sent him the books before. He's obviously just ignoring the facts. The other thing that was interesting, though, was in his presentation. Now, remember, the SSE at that time was almost all PhD, MD level, had to have a doctorate and interested in the field. So pretty high level.
Sorry, John. Could you just tell us what SSC is? Because I don't.
Yeah, Society for Scientific Exploration.
No, good one. Okay.
Yeah, and use the acronyms, but anyway, Sagan got up there and he was saying, "Look, it's okay for us to discuss these things in these venues, all these highly educated people, but we can't. You can't let the general public know about it, because they just can't deal with this." And you're going, I saw this in the Catholic Church as well. I'm trying to think of the cardinal who was that wrote the cardinal sins. The same sorts of things.
Mm.
It's one thing they want to discuss it internally, but the other, their parishioners are doing it, and
Mm.
it's the same thing. I mean, this is not something that's a secret or something that can be put in a can someplace and sequestered. No, these interesting. I had a phone call from a woman this evening, never met, but was asking about how do I test these things. So here's an individual. who's got legitimate questions about capabilities, things happening around her that want to go and get validated. And then you've got on the other end of the spectrum, of course, you have the pure materialists, and I'd put Sagan in that group and say it can't be, therefore it isn't.
Mm.
And you go, but as Dean Radin liked to say, the evidence for psi, if psi were a crime, it would be convicted, no doubt. The evidence is just overwhelming. When you say anyone that says there's no evidence means I haven't looked.
Yes, exactly. Oh, from I'd like to get your opinion about why there is such a virulent, and has been for so long, denial and pushback against it. I know we've talked about your experiences with Stargate, and the general who was religious, and the atheist. He said, "You're tricking me, but I don't know how you're doing it." And that's sort of par for the course, I guess. People who have blinkered mindsets, but there seems to be a bit more to it than that to me. Why is there such a fear of it, or just like an agenda to deny it?
Oh, well, I think that's actually kind of understandable. And that is, if you're a pure materialist, we can break things down and get to the God particle and everything built from there, as opposed to continuation of consciousness and interaction between consciousness and physical things. If your belief system is constructed on the pure materialistic, if these things are true, it's an affront to your entire belief system.
Illusion.
And that's very frightening. I tell a story. Was working with Cleve Baxter. This goes back to Army days. And Cleve was the guy who did the work on plants, polygraph on plants and things like that. And I had him under contract, and we were going to replicate his device. So I took a scientist with me from Night Vision Laboratory, and we went out and we're looking at that, and I just wanted him to just build the mechanics of it. It was a polygraph kind of thing that monitored consciousness and whatnot. And so he looks at it and he says, "We can build." He says, "Well, there's a piece missing." And I said, "That's my part. I'll take care of the missing piece," because he understood where this was going. And what he said quite clearly was, he says, "Look, I've cut this much out of the universe for me, and you can move things around here, and that's okay. Don't tell me I have to relearn physics because I don't want to hear it." I mean, it was that blatant. Now, by the way, the plus was he went back, he built the device, could have screwed me in a million ways, just leave a wire loose someplace. They built the system and it did work. But yeah, it's an affront to belief systems.
Yes. Well, I know that recently I had an old friend from my Christian days when I was involved in this, like a missionary group to the hippies back in the early 80s. And I was considered a pastor. I didn't think of myself like that, but they called me Pastor Dave. And so this friend wrote to me and said, "Oh, I'm quite shocked that you're engaging with all these people talking about, ESP and especially ancient aliens and things like that." And he gave me read me the riot act as far as my salvation, etc. And I was slightly unkind to him. I sent him a graph of all the executions that Yahweh ordered by book.
Yeah.
Just falling. And I didn't get an answer back, but I realized that, and I had the same experience when I first left the church. I realized that it's not about logic. It's about comfort. It's about being in that comfort zone. And it's like ripping away the baby's security blanket. And for some reason, a lot of people just haven't got the courage to do that. And for me personally, being a very devout, you know, what do we call it, charismatic Christian, you know, I felt like I really had a handle on God. And to think my way out of that, it was like, oh my God, what have I done? Now what do I believe? You know, where's my comfort gone? I'm not comfortable. But I thought,
Yeah.
well, I want to know the truth. I don't care less about being comfortable or in the club. I want to actually find out the truth. So yeah, um, I guess it's the same sort of thing, isn't it? Bless you.
I'm sorry about that.
Oh, that's all right.
Yeah.
It happens
No,
to.
yeah, the comfort zone, people don't like change. It can be very threatening, and that's in many, many areas. But when you have something like this, that I mean, the structure of the universe is not what you think it is. I guess story there. It was with Cleve Baxter, and we had the National Academy of Science was coming out. They were doing a study for the Army on all the weird shit that we were involved in. And so I said, well, you ought to take them there because we could demonstrate things in the laboratory and truncate the story because it could take hours. But what happened is they arrived and you want to make sure your experiment is running today, not that it ran yesterday or whatnot. So what had happened is I had gone to the laboratory. We were monitoring oral leukocytes, white cells in the mouth, and had put them in. And the theory is that it would pick up on one's emotional state, even though it's in a Faraday cage, you know. And in this case, it was in another wing of the building, and I'm in there. And uh, long story, but Cleve kept talking, and then I was going to get up and say, "Oh, by the way, I've independently replicated his work." And so I get up and I start to talk, and about 90 seconds into it, this lab assistant comes running into the room and says, "What happened a minute and a half ago?" And I said, "Well, that's when I started talking." And what you saw on the graph is just a huge, I mean, there was stoppers on it. But the point was, yeah, here I was telling the National Academy of Science that the universe isn't built the way they think it was. And yeah, that was an emotionally stimulating event.
Yes, absolutely. Wow. No, I love that portion of your chat with Sean because, you know, I think I wrote to you this. I've always had a connection with plants. And as much as I'd like to have a panda or a tiger as my kung fu spirit animal, I have trees. I can't really explain it, but trees are my teachers, and I'll often go to a tree and just put my hand on it and close my eyes. And sometimes I just like to be with a tree and say, "How are you?" And other times the trees tell me stuff, and they usually just say things like, I don't actually hear a voice, but it's like I sort of know what they're saying. They just sort of say, "Be like me," you know, like just stand here, don't stop stressing, reach to the sky, you know, let the energy flow, let your roots go into the earth, just be. But
Well, there's no doubt that they do have a consciousness and are aware of things going on around them. That was the essence of Cleve's early work.
yeah, well, it blew my mind. I have heard about this in the past, but I didn't realize you'd been involved in that. And I think I'd seen some like a Russian film, and I was wondering, I didn't know whether it was recreated or a bit of a hoax, but it was supposed to be a Russian laboratory, and they're burning the leaves on these plants and getting reactions.
Yeah.
But as you spoke about it, I got sort of excited. Like I wish that I could get a little like a home polygraph and stick it on all my some of my mates around here, and like on the back veranda, I got a lot of plants out there that I talk to regularly. And
Remember, the key part of that was the GSR, what's called galvanic skin response.
ah,
And so you don't have to have terribly sophisticated system that you can get some interesting results. And
So there might be a bit of a, what was that old magazine, National Mechanics, or remember that magazine, American
Popular Mechanics?
Popular Mechanics? Yeah, there's probably some kind of popular mechanics way to make your own polygraph or similar.
No, that material's available.
Mm.
You can get it there.
Something you mightn't know, I've sort of learnt it from my friend Professor Jacobson from the University of Iceland. Like, I have incredible luck in meeting people like yourself, and Professor Jacobson's the probably the world's greatest expert on Icelandic sagas, Viking sagas, and he's particularly into the paranormal. I think you would really like him. You'd really enjoy chatting. He's extremely nice man and extremely excellent English. But he sort of told me that the Viking creation myths, believe it or not, consider that humans came from logs and trees, and the first Adam and Eve sort of characters were basically two logs these sons of Odin find lying on the beach, and one of the great heroes of the sagas, a guy called Gunnar in Jarl's saga, he sort of, after this final battle where all his enemies come at him at his house and he fights them off and eventually dies, they bury him in this cairn and they put guys like him standing, or like sitting up, a bit like in Conan the Barbarian, the old king sitting there with his sword. And then his son and this other guy who are, this is interesting for such an old story, they sort of basically say they're skeptics. They don't believe, everyone else is talking, or we heard old Gunnar singing in his burial mound, a shepherd and a young lady, one of the servants, hears him singing and sounding really happy. So they tell his mum. She says, "Oh, don't go telling his son because he won't believe it. He doesn't believe in things like that." So these two hardcore old Viking characters, they go out this moonlit night, and the moon's particularly big and bright. And next thing, it seems like the mound's open and there's Gunnar sitting up in his grave, chanting and singing and looking really happy. And his voice is booming like we'd say, loudspeaker. And his verse talks about how he refused to give up his honor and he died, he died sticking up for what he believed. And then he calls himself a vet droger. And droga sort of means like undead. It's like almost like a vampire, but not necessarily. And so I wrote to the professor and said, "What does this word mean?" He said, "Well, it means a wet log." I think talking about all this log, all this sort of language of logs, people being logs. And you do know about the Druidic holy groves in the ancient Celtic tradition, and it looks like the Norse had the same sort of thing, like holy little forests, and they had this thing about trees.
Well, my favorite was probably Lagatha.
Yeah, yeah, you told me that, and I agree.
Yeah.
You've got something about it, that lady. She's. I mean, the world's full of beauties, but there's something about her face, something about her eyes. She's a very attractive woman.
Yeah.
But scary too. Like the way she killed that young bloke, she sort of marries him and goes, "Oh, by the way, I married you so quickly."
Well, that was Ragnar and
Yeah, Ragnar. I think that there's never been a lot of good Viking movies and TV series, but what I loved about the Viking series is that they took the spirituality quite seriously, and they had a go at, when Ragnar's sort of tripping and he sees Odin, and he sees the ravens, and there's the old man with, I don't know, it's leprosy or what, who's the seer. They
Uh,
they played it very sympathetically, um, as something that was really happening.
uh,
Yeah.
uh, Quite a series. Anyway,
Can I ask you more questions? How's your time?
sure.
Yeah.
Please do.
Um, could you tell me about your recent seminars? And your most recent one was when you went to, uh, was it?
Yeah. Well, actually, we just returned from the UK, Essex. So there's a place there called Arthur Findlay College, which is pretty unique. It is for mediums, and I mean the history of the location itself is quite amazing. It literally goes back to the 10th, 12th century. It turns out that the lords of that used to be a castle has been reconstructed. Obviously, in a millennia, it has changed somewhat over time. But they said the lords of that area were the ones who went and had forced the Magna Carta to be signed.
Really?
And it's interesting because the area now, if you get outside of that, Stanford, in fact, I was surprised Stanford Airport is considered part of London, even though it's an hour outside. Uh, but the lands there are pretty much like they were a millennia ago.
Mm.
That somehow the urbanization has been kept far enough away from it. But they have a series of courses, and we saw some pretty amazing stuff. Now, I went, my wife was the one, Victoria was the one who wanted to go, and she did get into going in. It was specifically in trance and bloody thing. And I had told them that I was coming kind of as an observer, what we might call monitoring a course, because I did not want to get into the situation where I was supposed to be playing the part of a medium and that, because I don't consider myself to be a medium at all. But as luck would have it, and kind of what I predicted is a lot of practical exercises, and you broke down into pairs. And the group I was in, just all of us seemed to have an odd number, so I would become the sponsor and did some hands-on healing and things of that nature. But yeah, it's a spiritualist, basically based on spiritualism, as a religion per se, and going into trance and contacting the folks. Uh, yeah, it's particularly when they get into contacting entities, not just Aunt Sally or Uncle John who left or something like that, but we're starting to talk to other spiritual entities and contracting them. It gets really quite interesting.
Mm. And I suppose the thing coming from that Christian background I had, the standard Christian idea about this sort of thing is that it's dangerous, it's potentially demons you're talking to.
Yeah, oh yeah. Well, I get back. Remember what we discussed before, the way back talking about remote viewing and that. And that was some of the opposition that came in at, literally chief of staff of the army level.
Mm.
Was This is anti-Christian. Yes, you can do it, but it's work of the devil. And so we had that with several programs, and yeah, the fundamentalist Christian thing does reach in at very high levels of government in some cases. You may even watch the shenanigans that are going on with our current uh, political, well,
Mm.
whatever you'd call it. It's a crisis, I would call it. But the point is that certainly playing to a strong, quote, Christian base are very fundamentalist, and you do this, and you are the devil.
Mm. Yeah, I can understand that. And as an Australian, we have a tradition of disliking religion. Like, it's funny, but a Christian-based country, but at the grassroots, Australians don't like Bible bashers. They don't like wowsers, people who, no, you shouldn't drink, you shouldn't smoke, you shouldn't have sex. Australians don't like that. And if people...
We don't either.
But it's always seemed to me that is much more concentrated, like the Bible Belt thing in the States. Like I had a conversation by email with a guy who'd left Christianity. It was just a group where people who'd been Christians and, like myself, been in positions of leadership, were talking about what it was like to leave. And this guy was telling me about just how he sort of lost his whole family virtually. Like, he was shunned by almost everybody he knew because he'd walked away from the true faith. So therefore he's handing himself over to burn in a pit of eternal peril. And we were discussing it, and I said, well, funny enough, it was heaps easier in Australia because actually the majority of people don't believe it. And being a Christian you're the odd one out. And that's something I struggled with as a young fella, because my belief was based on a real experience of God. It wasn't just a head trip.
Right.
And so, yeah, I sort of had to keep it quiet because people just didn't like it. They assumed you were going to start, Bible bashing, where I'd be going, no, God's actually real. Like, it's true. But
this reminds me of a couple of things. In antiquity, was the president of the International Association for Near-Death Studies. And as that was progressing, ran into a lot of objections of, and this was bad because people had these very real experiences. You had the materialists, the doctors that say, I can fix that, I'll give you a shot. We'll just make it go away. But then you had the Christian. As you know, we've also done a lot of work with ayahuasca. And my point is, it seems to me that the church, the fundamentalist area, they want to be the arbiter of truth.
yes.
And anything that allows direct communication or direct experience, is a threat to their power base.
Exactly.
And it's a power trip.
Yeah, it really is. And it's hard to justify it now when we're all so literate, not just able to read the great libraries of the world if we actually wanted to, but we can access so much information, yet people still want to control thinking. It's like with that friend of mine, I said, had a go at me, are you going to lose your salvation because you're talking to people like that John Alexander? He didn't really say that, but that's what he meant. Yeah, you're talking to all these suspect people. And the thing is, I said to him, why have you ever studied the history of the church? Have you ever read up on who decided on what the Bible is? Because they base it on, oh, this is the perfect word of God, unassailable, everything is perfect. Okay, who put that together and at what time? And was it straight? Did Jesus handwrite it, or was it put together like hundreds of years later? And why would you believe those people? And that type of rational looking at, you'd do that with any other subjects, but as soon as you get into the spiritual, it's like, oh, no, this is the great tradition and it's unassailable. And just the fact that there's so many religions who all reckon they're spot on immediately makes you think, well, they can't all be right. And yeah, it doesn't make any sense. But so
it's problematic.
Yeah, just getting back to the trance medium experience. do you feel that it's a safe thing to do to try and contact your ancestors? Is it?
Well, I don't know. No, some of this is contacting ancestors. There's some work I can't get into. It's embryonic, but way, way beyond ancestors. But I'll tell you one experience that I had because we ended up and I was observing, and this was supposed to be where two mediums would face each other and quote go into trance and that. And I was watching a young woman, I found out later, not quite as young as I thought she was, but I saw some things trigger physiologically and said, boy, going, I mean, just almost instantaneously going in a trance and then getting very deep and then coming out of it. And in the discussion that followed, it turns out that she's had psychic phenomena all her life, and this is now decades later. But the trance mediumship is very new. But her problem was that she described she was going into trance spontaneously in public. I mean, not trying to do it.
Mm.
It was kind of an uncontrollable thing, which led to a degree, of course, embarrassment. And
Mm.
so the issue there, she's taking a lot of advanced training on it. But to get these things, because you can imagine what it's like if you're sitting with somebody and all of a sudden, yeah, this was not a coven or group that's trying to do these things, but all of a sudden somebody's in trance and starts blurting out all kinds of information that,
Mm.
but yeah, it was a pretty intense experience.
Yeah, it must have been. Do you do you feel from your, long experience that there are more credible people now putting an effort into, like people like yourself, putting an effort into making headway in this field?
Oh, absolutely. Let me tell you, familiar with Gary Nolan?
Yes.
Okay. Gary was over at the house a couple months ago, and we were discussing it. And has the Soul Foundation, SOL Foundation, and they had had a big show and tell out at Stanford University, and I had gone out for that. Um, but what I didn't know was I knew there was some flap. Now go back like early now, I think it was about 92. John Mack had a conference. He and Dave Pritchard both at MIT. John was from Harvard. Pritchard was from MIT. And when we arrived, everybody had to sign a statement that says, "We understand this is not by MIT. This is the facilities." So Gary told me the story that it was shortly before the conference was set up and everything was rolling along. And a few weeks before the conference, he was called in to, it was there's something that protects the name of Stanford. And he's going like, "Oh Lord, what are we going to do? We're going to have to move find a new venue or something like that." Quite the difference. The Stanford University wanted to say the conference is by Stanford, supported by Seoul. Actually, it was the other way around. My point there was, you see this completely different take by, major institutions. 3 decades ago, you know, this ain't us, it just happens to be here. So now Stanford do it. Harvey Loeb was also there. You see now the same thing at Harvard with the Department of Astronomy doing it. So I think this signals a dramatic shift in acceptability, and that these very staid conservative institutions willing to put their imprimatur on research in these areas. And that's, to me, a seismic shift.
It is, isn't it? Wow. But yeah, it's Gary Nolan, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that amazed me that somebody of his level of scientific eminence should be
Yeah.
talked about. And you know, he did you see that interview with him and Ross Coulthard?
Right. By the way, it's interesting because just for level, he works at the Nolan lab at Stanford. I
Right.
mean, has his own laboratory and that. So, I mean, he is way up the food chain.
So he came to your house. He's a friend of yours.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. That's amazing who you know. It blew me out. He actually did speak in this interview with Ross, who you know you'd know as an Aussie.
Right. Russ was at the Seoul conference. That's the first time I met him. I met him at the conference there.
All right, yeah, he's a very famous Aussie. Like when I first saw him making In Plain Sight, I went, "Whoa, this guy's talking about this," because he was just, you know, I sort of grew up. He was just one of those very serious journalists, you know, 60 Minutes, I think it was. He was
Yeah.
main guys, but they talked about ancient aliens. They talked about um, I'm sure that Nolan talked about retrieved craft or you know um, this phenomenon going back a long, long, long time. And you know, obviously, I'm interested in anybody like that that can back up my idea that this is possible. If you know, there've been visitations in the ancient past. But yeah, his opinion
Well,
carries a lot of weight.
I got to give Gary credit because he's at Nobel level and, basically said that people told him, you're giving up the Nobel Prize
Really?
because of his work in oncology and that he says worth it.
Yeah, what a man.
That this work is that serious.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, you know, to for somebody at that level, and even yourself, it's always amazed me that, you know, a special forces colonel should, you know, openly come forward and say, you know, that amazing article you wrote for the military magazine. Sorry, I'm just trying to remember what it's called. You know, your article
Was
had,
it Sentinel?
yeah, it had the hands, the sort of pictures of the hands that had been scanned with like showing the energy auras, I think.
Yeah.
It's
Well,
on,
I've done several articles for them,
yeah,
but
it's your one
yeah,
on, it was in the military
yeah.
magazine, but to,
I think you're talking about Military Review, which goes back.
yeah, I think it was one of
Yeah,
the new ones.
that goes back to 1980.
Yeah, exactly. That's the one I got off your website. But for somebody like me, I've got nothing to lose because number one, I've been an artist for 30 years, so I'm obviously got slightly a screw loose that I don't have a real job, that I've been painting pictures and writing poetry and thinking strange things, but I've got nothing to lose. If people think I'm a crackpot, so what? You know, I
Yeah.
haven't got tenure or anything like that. But people like yourself and Gary and you know Ross Coulthard, so many of these people, I salute them because they're just going, well, why wouldn't I do this? It's you know, this is very interesting. It's potentially world changing, and so it's got to be done. You know.
Well, you say you want to see the scars.
Uh, your Vietnam story, I really felt for you, you know, when you said you don't like talking about it because it brings back things. And funny enough, I was just a mere policeman for 3 years, but I've been haunted by strange dreams, and I know that it's not like what a soldier in action would have to suffer, but I know it's disturbing at times. You know, there's things that I go through that are hard to explain, but um, yeah, I love that interview. You know, it's really you. You know, it's your life so interesting. Well, I
Well,
suppose
thank you.
there's only one last thing I want to ask you.
Okay.
When I first found you on that the special on the end of the push film
Right.
DVD, the science behind the that's it.
Well,
Science behind the
fiction.
fiction, yeah.
Yeah.
Where you set me free from hiding my strange experiences. I thought, wow, if this guy is saying this is real, I believe him. I really do. I believe this man. I can see he's the real thing. And it really did set me free and set me on this current course. I blame you. You set me on this current course.
I
But you
hope
said,
your wife doesn't feel that way.
look, she's been married to an artist for 30 years. She just loves me. And yeah, my weirdness is just part of the attraction. She's not into it, but she just likes the fact that I enjoy it. But you talked about a Russian KGB colonel who could break people's necks with his mind. You're talking about telekinesis or
Kokolov.
yes, I think that. Could you
Yeah.
tell us a bit about that? Because that's always
There wasn't people. No, the information. He was a KGB defector. And you've also got to remember this is the bad old days. This is Soviet Union, not Russia today, which is self problematic. But now, actually, the experiment was one using a submarine. One of the questions that's always come up is how is this transmitted? The information. And the natural application or thought was that it's got to be some kind of electromagnetic. And so a lot of tests have been done using Faraday cages and submarines. Stephen Schwartz has done similar work with submarines as well, because that's at depth shielded, so there's no way this is a electromagnetic wave going out.
yeah.
So what they had done, the experiment I think you're describing actually was with rabbits, and the point was that they had rabbits with they litters or whatever a bunch of baby rabbits are. Um, and what they had done is they were monitoring. They had I forget whether the female was on the submarine or was on the shore, but they started taking the her offspring and killing them at a distance. And the point was that they were getting a response at a distance, that awareness that this was taking place. And yeah, the issue of when you get into PK, well, what we haven't, and I think an area, dim Mac,
Yep.
yeah, that gets to something that's really very similar. Now, dim Mac, of course, is based on, the energy system of the body and interrupting that. The story there that won't go into the whole thing, but there was a study done by Siri, which was the survival, evasion, resistance, and escape that was being set up. Nick Rowe was the commander, and he had been actually in my area in Vietnam, but he had been captured and was held 5 years. And we got him back just at the time in December of just before I had left 68. So they put him in charge of the camp, and he had heard about this. And the question was, can you do these things? And we had an individual, I'd say a guy, but his name literally was Guy Savelli, who was a martial artist. And using Jim, what they did was, and this is where the whole men who stare at goats came from, by the way. Yeah, they had a goat lab at Fort Bragg or Fort Liberty now, And the what they do is they've got the vocal cords have now been cut, but the intent here is you take the goat, and the medics go through an extensive period of training, and they end up shooting the goat because what they say the first time you see a bullet wound, you don't want it to be on the battlefield. So they have the patient. So what happened was they have the goats, it was hobbled in front of it and applying dim mak. Now the idea here is that you have the energy systems, that control all of acupuncture and that, and you interrupt the energy system, but it is not, a hard hit or anything like that. It's a boom, and death takes place later, but near instantaneously. And so what happened was there's some discussion as to whether a guy or one of the NCOs who were with him actually applied the force to the goat. So the goat's hobbled and in front of time-lapse photography. And sure enough, a few hours later, it goes boop and drops. Now they did a necropsy on it, and I saw the necropsy. What was interesting, normally when you get an event like that, the heart contracts and expelling all of the blood. And in this case, the ventricles were still full of blood. What was of interest to me is if you look across the thoracic region, that if you've ever seen how a bullet goes through a body, it goes through and energy radiates out from it. But you had a pattern that looked like a bullet going across the thoracic region, but there's no wound of entrance or wound of exit.
Wow.
And it looked like it. And again, the death occurred later, but just damn near instantaneously. So yeah, dim mak is real.
Wow. You've heard it from the goat himself. The the young people have a saying. I always forget what it means. But it's
Well, I did not do that, but I definitely saw the necropsy
yeah,
that
that's
was
just an
done.
incredible story. Yeah, that's one of those stories you just think that changes everything. Because I know in a lot of martial arts they say, oh, this is fake, it's just an old story.
Folklore.
People, yeah, it's not real. Um,
It's real.
yeah, far out. Well, thanks for that. That'll be a good place to end off on that outrageous story.
Okay.
Like, have you ever heard that saying, calling somebody the goat?
Yep. No,
We're sort of old
I've
bloke.
heard it. I've
Of all
I've
time.
heard it. What I don't have is with the goat. I have the evidence for this. That's interesting folklore.
Yeah, I just remember what it is. If you call my son's generation, the 20-year-olds, etc., they call somebody the goat, it means the greatest of all time. It basically means a legend. So that's why it's calling you a goat. A goat.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, John. And thanks for giving me your time. You're a very kind man.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'll see you. I've got to go and get my kids from school and do a few things, and I'm sure you've got some evening left, hopefully.
Yeah, about time for dinner. It's getting a little late.
All right. Well, all the very best, and I look forward to seeing you again.
Okay, we'll do it. Let me know. Thank you.
Okay. See ya.